Hey everyone, my name is Ben Chaish. I'm a wedding and elopement photographer based in the Pacific Northwest. And today we're talking about one of my favorite, kind of more budget, but well-performing lenses for the Leica M system. It happens to be a tiny, super portable little lens that I've shot most of my personal work over the last 2 years with. And that is the amazing Voigtlander 28mm f2 Ultron. Now this lens is obviously just tiny and kind of, I think when you think of a Leica camera and you think of just the small form factor, portability, that whole thing, I feel like, at least in my mind, this is the kind of lens that I picture. I have a lot of larger lenses, some fast primes and stuff like that. Well, I guess all Leica lenses are mostly primes outside of a couple outliers, but I have a few larger, high-performing lenses that I wouldn't say are very portable. They're definitely smaller than, SLR or normal, Canon RF mirrorless lenses, but still on such a small body, I feel like the weight ends up being something of a deterrent. Like my Zeiss 35mm Distagon is an amazing lens. It's one of the best lenses I have. But the problem is it's just so large that I don't want to carry it around very much. The thing about this Voigtlander, though, is it is tiny. And I think one of the things that I've most sort of learned lately is just how much I appreciate winning the sort of balance test. So if a camera and lens combination can kind of just sit here without falling over, like this one does, it kind of wins the Leica balance test for me, which means that it is a well-balanced and super portable lens. I love any time that I can just set this thing down, not worry about it falling over and being super lens heavy. If you're carrying it around and sticking it on your side or whatever, the lens isn't just flopping down. This thing is tiny, so it fits that profile of something that allows you to just bring this camera anywhere with you and not be a hindrance, not be cumbersome. It's small enough that is a little bit bigger than like a small point and shoot. And that's kind of like the appeal for a lot of Leica photographers, is that small form factor, super unobtrusive. This lens is tiny, doesn't shout anything at you. It's just the perfect size, and honestly, one of the biggest reasons that I think picking this lens up makes a lot of sense for people. And then the second and sort of obvious thing is just the 28mm focal length. I feel like for a lot of reasons, and maybe I'll just do a review and just video about the 28mm in general, but I think the iPhone and that whole series of mobile photography has really pushed me and a lot of other people into enjoying the 28mm focal length a little bit more. I know that the iPhone camera has kind of moved from like 32 down to, I think it's like 26 now. But kind of that 28 is that mid-range, and it's something that feels really natural for a lot of people. It's something they're really used to. And so for me, 28mm gives me something that's a little bit wider, has a little bit more context than the typical 35mm lens, which I think, honestly, if you're thinking about buying a Leica and buying just a personal lens and you're only going to have one for this system, I think 35mm makes the most sense for most people. So I definitely recommend that. But for someone for me, I have young kids, and one of my young kids is 4.5, and he is running constantstanding. I was finding that 35mm a lot of the time in tight enclosed spaces, we live in an old house, 35mm sometimes just wasn't wide enough. And so 28 became kind of my go-to. I bought a Fujifilm Class W that I've included in some videos and stuff like that, so that I could get that wider perspective, wider focal length. And so 28 just works really, really well. And then on top of that, you get this tiny form factor and you get an f2 lens. So on my Leica M6 here, You know, it's a film camera, meaning that I can't change my ISO. This has an ISO dial here, but that only is to set what the meter's reading. I can't actually set my ISO to anything different than what the film stock is. So having an f2 on here allows me to photograph in lower light situations, and essentially, you know, saves me a little bit of money because the higher the film speed is, typically the more expensive that film is. So I can shoot, you know, cheaper films like Kodak Gold 200 or even like Ultramax 400 and get really good results with this thing because I'm shooting at f2 often in, you know, indoors and stuff like that instead of 2.8, which is kind of the limitation for a lot of other budget lenses. Now, another thing that I've kind of been shifting to in my work a little bit is moving to that kind of 50mm and 28mm setup. I know I talked about it a little bit in my Class W video, but I find that for the work that I do as a wedding and elopement photographer, getting a little bit wider perspective from my wide lens at a 28, I use 35mm as my widest perspective for a long time, and ended up having to take often 3 vertical images, stitch them together, and get somewhere in the range of like a 21mm perspective for, you know, really big, expansive things. But I do find that even though I do have a 21mm lens, the 28 most of the time can kind of capture the environment well without making things seem big and crazy and exaggerated. So it's not super impressive and distinct, but I feel like the focal length is just about the widest you can get and still feel normal. So it's definitely a wide angle lens. When you pick this up and shoot it, especially if you have a 0.72 magnification camera, it is to the edges of the viewfinder, especially as someone that wears glasses. You know, if I stick my eye way in here, it's a different story and I can see a little bit outside. So I've been using this a lot on weddings and elopements, and I've been getting really good results from it. I would say that for the vast majority of photographers, the center sharpness of this lens and the character that it gives are more than enough. If I was not a professional photographer and didn't do a lot of paid work that I consider high end, I think this lens performs beautifully, especially wide open in the center. The only time that you're going to sort of start to run into issues is if you're shooting wide open in the corners. That's where I find that this lens kind of has the most trouble. It's not the sharpest lens in the world, but sharpness, especially again at the center, is definitely acceptable for most things, and especially on film. I feel like film and this lens pair beautifully. I find that on digital, that's where you start seeing a lot more of the imperfections in a lot of lenses. There are some things that Lightroom can do to kind of like help with field curvature and vignetting and all that kind of stuff. But I feel like the character of this lens really shines through on film. And for a personal lens, as this was like the thing that I used probably the most over the last year and a half, 2 years or so, this was the lens that was most often on my M6, and I really did love shooting with it. So the pros for this lens, it is a super compact, very inexpensive 28mm focal length with an f2 aperture. There's a good reason why it is one of the, I feel like, the more popular lenses that people talk about when they're talking about this system. I would say that pairing this, if you were going to go for 2 lenses, pairing this lens with a 50mm, maybe a 50 summicron, maybe if you're trying to save some money and you have someone that can calibrate it, the TT Artisan's 50 1.8. I reviewed that lens and I feel like that would be an amazing combo with this, especially for personal work. It just does a really great job for the size, the price, everything. I think it is one of the best buys you can make in this system. So thanks so much for watching. If you have any questions about this lens, please let me know. I will try to answer as many of them as I can. I've definitely shot plenty of rolls of film and multiple, weddings and elopements and things like that on it. So I've shot thousands of frames through this thing and feel like I have a really good grasp of how it performs in different scenarios. And if you like this kind of stuff, I'm making tons of camera and photography reviews and stuff like that. I'm going to be pushing hard into this in the coming weeks, months. So subscribe. I think about 80% of people that watch my videos aren't subscribed to this channel. So subscribing would be a great idea if you want to see more stuff like this. So thanks again, and I will see you on the next one.